Awesome. All right. Good to have everybody here. This is our first Kindly People Ops talk show where we discuss really how we can help each other work together. So we have some nice panelists on our show today that will be able to share some insights on working in international remote teams. A lot of times today, people are talking about working from home. This is dealing with working from home, but working with teammates that may be in another time zone, another country, what to consider, and how you can continue to collaborate and continue to grow with these individuals. So just a couple of reminders. If you have any questions, feel free to put them into the question box, the Q&A box, where we can all upvote. And if you have need any clarifications, feel free to put those in there. And also the chat panel is up, so you can message to panelists or to your fellow attendees and say hello, or if there's anything, perhaps links or anything like that you want to share, feel free to put those in there. So to begin, we're going to talk about international remote work and team collaboration. To begin with, we have Austin Romansky and Lance Gravovsky. So let's go ahead, Austin first. If we could just get just a small introduction and what you're currently up to these days.
Yeah, so my name is Austin Romansky. I am a designer and a project overseer for a coffee subscription company, and also run a design firm with Lance below me. Well, he's not below me in the sense you guys know what I mean. In the video, he's below me, guys. But yeah, so I do that. I've worked remotely in a couple different places internationally. Mostly I lived in Thailand a couple years, doing those same things. So right now we moved back to the States because we had a human progeny come forth. And so we moved back to help make that easier for her life. And yeah, we're here now in Portland, Oregon, and loving life.
Nice. Lance?
I kind of been doing this and that digitally for past 4 or 5 years or so, and living around the world. Lived in Nicaragua for a while and managed some social media accounts for a few different local businesses in Seattle, where I lived before then. Uh, I was living in Kenya when I started working with Austin for Romansky Designs, and again doing this all the social media for that coffee company. Now we work together, and I'm back in the States. But I don't know if you were in Thailand, Austin, while I was also in Kenya at that time, but I don't know the timeline exactly. But that was where I got my start with Austin.
Nice. So you are both no strangers to working in different time zones with people in different areas. So kind of to begin our discussion here today, I was thinking, what are maybe Austin? We can take your thoughts on this first, but what are some uh, maybe some pros and cons, some things that you really loved? Maybe we'll take the pros first. Like, what did you really love about working in that environment? And then Lance will ask for your pros as well.
Um, I would say the number one pro for me being able to work that way is also the number one con, in that being able to work anywhere is just amazing. Like being able to have, as long as you have a decent laptop and some Wi-Fi, or maybe not even Wi-Fi, you can get work done and get paid. To me, is just an incredible, freedom to have. Um, that being said, it is one of the biggest downsides working from anywhere, because you end up working anywhere, anytime, because you can. So that we'll get into cons more, but definitely that freedom is definitely like, I just can't imagine not having that.
And I guess for me, like before I started working in the digital realm, I mainly worked in like construction or labor jobs, as a bike mechanic for so many years or whatever. And uh, when I was single, I didn't mind that. It was actually kind of nice to like have to go somewhere early in the morning and hang out with the guys and work hard all day and come back and drink a few beers and go to sleep, you know. But once I got married, like the idea of like leaving my wife and going to work all day, like just killed me. So, uh, like being able to, you know, we live in a small RV, like do all the work that I need to do with my headphones on, and then at any moment, like she knows like when I'm deep working and not to interrupt me, but like at any moment we can talk, we can converse, you know, like we can have lunch together at any point, and I think that's probably, I'm sure Austin agrees, having a baby too, like being able to see your family, like the majority of the time is super huge.
And for Lance, he's not kidding. On meetings, we'll have meetings, and like Karina will duck out from the background, bring him like a plate of food, and he like rudely shushes her away, and then she'll like come back and get his plate, and then bring him something else. I'm like, man, this is a nice setup.
All I have to do is just, and she comes.
There's that's your local team collaboration going on, right, Lance? Very nice. So we'll let now like so those are some of the benefits and Austin, obviously you brought out that maybe the benefit was also the con, maybe in having that balance. Um, have you, Kevin? I was going to ask you. Have you found? I mean, maybe you've worked in a lot of different locations. When you're working with a team, have you found that like the ability to work uh, like right where you are at that moment? Has it been like something that's been a positive thing or something that kind of has it's like that two-edged sword?
Yeah, it definitely cuts both ways. I think because I've lived it for a while now, I definitely fall on the side of people who think the pros outweigh the cons. Um, but yeah, it's super enabling. I've lived in an RV for the past 3 years up until Sunday, and I've worked up and down the west coast of the U.S., not internationally, but just still working remotely. And I've been working remotely in the States for about 10 years now. And the difference between the connectivity, excuse me, the connectivity and the proximity to like Austin and Lance mentioned, my family, it's awesome. It definitely has some cons to it. Like I notice it's a lot harder for me to separate things um, from one another, and even now it's getting worse post COVID because my wife owns a salon, and so Whitney and I, work on that together a lot. But post COVID, that's turning into like media production and maybe remote education, and my these separate areas of my life are starting to converge, which is nice to not have a context shift. But it's changed it to be where like now I want an office and I don't want to just have like a little space on a table because like I have enough stuff to keep track of that I want it ready to walk back into. But anyways, the positive is definitely being able to be around Whitney, even work together sometimes on things at the same time, and then also not having to limit my choice about where I live for such a long period of time and getting to explore some states I hadn't lived in and some areas I hadn't lived in. That's been really, really nice for being as young as I am, right? Like that's something people a lot of times wait till later to figure or go do and enjoy.
Nice, and that's actually kind of interesting point. So like with your circumstances, because you're free to work wherever you are, they're converging in your the skill sets that you're learning are converging. Let's talk about that. We'll get to some of the other specifics of working internationally with the team here later on, but let's talk about that for just a minute. Do you? We'll start here, Lance, with yourself. Have you found that working internationally has created any kind of opportunities for you to learn new things because of your situation? And if so, like what is it that you were trying to learn or that you did learn?
I think probably, I don't know if I learned like any specific skill or tool, but I think it just like where we lived, we had a family of like 7 kids right above us in the apartment above us, and they would just run around like outside our apartment screaming all day long. So like to me, like it taught me, or it helped my ability to just focus, like no matter what was going on, which I think is definitely important now because like I mentioned, like my wife is home all the time, like we're always together. Being able to like turn my brain off to everything around me and just focus has really helped. And I didn't really have that before, living internationally. I don't think. In addition, maybe learning how to work offline, because as you guys know, like the internet is not great in most countries outside the U.S. and the developed world. But when the internet would go out, I would have to find like, okay, like what can I do offline now? So like, do I have to write that article in Grammarly, or can I write it in notes and then put it in Grammarly later? And I do that a lot now today too, not because I need to, but just to turn off the Wi-Fi and focus for a little bit.
Nice, very nice. Thanks for sharing. How about you, Austin?
Yeah, I didn't know how to answer, and then hearing Lance helped me because I think same thing. One thing, like especially Lance and I, any company we've worked with, or especially our company, we we're pretty anti-social media advocates and staying away from that for mental and emotional health. But um, that being disconnected, it definitely helps you with that. Helps you cope with it and helps you to kind of just be okay with it. And then another thing was really discipline and self-control. Kind of Lance is what Lance touched on too. Is that when you I think when you go into work for like a 9 to 5 or whatever, you're kind of forced in some sense to, at the very least, pretend like you're working or being productive because people physically see you and talk to you. And but when you're at home, I mean, I can, especially now with a baby, I can go days and not ever work if I let myself. Like it'll catch up eventually. It's definitely not immediate. Like if I was just at work sleeping, someone would say, "Hey, dude, what are you doing?" But like when I'm at home, no one's watching. I can play with my baby, and I'm like, "Oh, the day's over. I didn't really do anything." And so that kind of helps force you into coming up with routines. It's definitely helped my, you know, scheduling tasks and prioritizing them. It's helped with self-control and when I need to. First, self-control, you learn it to make sure you stay working when you could easily not. But then eventually that turns into self-control of stopping work when you really need to. So I would say that's definitely helped.
Nice, finding that balance, and then also, yeah, holding yourself accountable. That can be tough, um, or it can take some time to figure out for yourself. One thing that Lance touched on that we'll go into is tools. So tools, you mentioned some certain tools that you use to work offline. What are some tools that you guys have found to be, and this is something too that Robert asks a question on. He says, "What tools do you use to figure out time zones for meetings?" So that's actually a really good one because it's one that does definitely come up working internationally. So maybe Kevin, we can start with you. What if you have any thoughts about this? What tools you've used? Let us know.
Yeah, so I have definitely tried really hard to use the Mac OS World Clock as a reference. Um, Often I think of it a little bit too late whenever I'm trying to reference, but at the moment I have Seattle, Denver, Minneapolis, New York, London, and Impal. So I've been using it lately in this period of my life. For meetings specifically, I really like, I think it's called World. There is some other meeting World Clock or something like that. I'm going to try to find the link to actually paste it in there. But there's a couple of those websites that I've found confusing as far as the UI goes, but if you stick with it, you can actually confirm, like, yes, this is the right time in that person's time zone this time of year. But I'll get a link for it.
Nice. Austin, how about you?
I'd say I'm a terrible example of this because I don't really use tools and I've suffered from it multiple times. I will just say a couple things that I've just done is try to remember key, time frames, East Coast, West Coast, um, in other areas. That's helped. I've just gotten the habit. Living in Thailand, I just switched mentally to military time, so I use that just naturally now. So learning and getting comfortable with that, it takes a while, a couple months, but you eventually it's automatic. And then also just getting used to typing or even saying the PST, EST, whatever it is. Like I've definitely gotten used to that because that's thrown a lot of meetings into haywire. Because a lot of times you meet someone, if you have lead generation out there stuff, you don't even realize you're talking to someone in another time zone. So just getting used to clarifying that naturally helps a lot. But I would say I would love to hear and see some tools too, because I've never really used any personally.
Yeah, that's it's fair. I know for me, working in India, I was it was 12-hour difference from central or from the central time zone of the United States, and but actually it wasn't 12, it was 12 and a half hours. So that was an added layer of complication. It wasn't just an addition of 12, it was an addition of 12 and a half. And I found that using in Google Calendar, you get the you have the option to do two time zones or have it to display two time zones. So I would have the central time zone, and then I would also have my local time zone, and I would have that primary, and then secondary would be the central time zone. So then I was able to see what the person that scheduled the meeting, or if I scheduled it with them, what they were experiencing, and then obviously how it applied to me. So it helped me a ton to be able to keep things straight. How about you, Lance?
I never used any tools ever, and I had to Google it every single time. I memorized at one point the difference between Portland time and Kenya time because that was like the main one I had to deal with, and then also uh, I was teaching in China as well, so from Kenya, so like I memorized that difference too, and those were like the two main ones I had to use. So I would just have to count out every single time, and I probably could use a tool to make it a lot easier, but I'm dumb.
Kevin?
Hey, I was just testing it out. You're not dumb, Lance. That's a good way to do it. If you type in Google, I just tested this out, 3 p.m. PST, 2, and then whatever thing you want to convert it to. Google itself will like tell you what it is right away. So I just did 3 p.m. PST to EST, and it says 6 p.m. Thursday Eastern time. But that's actually a smart way to do it because you could actually just solve the that particular equation. I get honestly that world clock UI, it trips me up every single time, like the world time buddy thing I posted in the chat. Once you figure it out, you can do it, but it takes me like 5 minutes. So I like that idea of typing it into Google.
I don't know about you guys, but every time I do it, I'm not very intelligent, so like I always have some very probably way longer way of figuring it out. Like, okay, so if I add 2 hours and then reverse the PM AM and then add 45 minutes,
I try to work it like
and
fractions.
yeah, exactly. Like I always had this way where eventually I'd come to it, but then I think no matter what I did, like Lance, I would just be like, I'm not sure though, so I'm just gonna check. That's smarter though. I would just type in what time is it in, and then it would bring it up. And then I still have to do the math, which is stupid. So that's really good.
No, yeah, I actually, yeah, I think that Lance, you jumped ahead. You took it to the next level. Well, along that same kind of line of thought, talking about time, because that's a huge consideration when we're talking about working, especially internationally, figuring out what time things are at, figuring out your overlap maybe with your coworkers, your teammates, or your manager. One question that Robert brought up in the question box is, do you avoid Monday or scheduling Monday or Friday meetings because of the international date line? Now, I do have some thoughts on this, but I think to start off, uh, Austin, do you have any thoughts on this?
I think for me, always depended where I was and where the who I'm meeting with regularly, where if they're behind or ahead, I guess. So like for me, I would work at midnight every time over working at like 8 a.m. Like I'm not a morning person, so I hate working in the mornings. So I would like it would depend again. If I was when I was in Thailand, we were 12, 14 hours ahead of Central, I think, of when I was working with a Kindly Ops. I think that was around there. So like having a 10 o'clock p.m. meeting was perfect for me. And I think the reverse would have been the rest of the whole team working at like 7 p.m., but me working at like 8 a.m. or something. And it was just like, there's no way. So again, I think for me, the Monday, Friday thing, I think just because of weekends, I usually avoid. But yeah, again, it depended. And again, not a morning person, so that was kind of a heavy factor into what I would choose.
How about you, Lance?
Sorry, my internet's starting to slow down. Can you guys hear me? Okay.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
we
I can
can.
hear you still. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, for me, uh, because like we mentioned earlier about the freedom of this kind of schedule, you can kind of plan when you want to work anyways. And I've always been kind of a night owl freak when it comes to sleep schedules and everything. And sometimes I wake up at 4 a.m. and start working. Other times I work until 4 a.m. And so for me, it's like if I was somewhere and someone needed to meet me Monday 9 a.m. their time, but it was some crazy time for me, it never really mattered much to me if as long as I didn't have a prior engagement.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the key. It's like we mentioned before about like Kevin mentioned before even too about having that balance between your work life and your non-work life. Sometimes with those meetings that go on Mondays and Fridays, they kind of have a tendency to bleed into those things naturally because my perhaps maybe my Monday is or that the client's Monday is my Sunday night, or vice versa. So yeah, it's kind of a tough thing, but I think like traditionally speaking, or Mondays and Fridays usually never good, just because they're just prone to cancellations. Things happen, and when you're going to take off, usually it's that Monday when things aren't starting the way you wanted it to, or it's that Friday when you just sort of want to be done with the week. So I've found personally that scheduling it, even working internationally, scheduling it on those times, it's just it's possible, it's doable, but it's usually a recipe for things to get canceled. Yeah. What do you think about that, Kevin? Is that something you've run into too?
I haven't run into it in a way that I've been able to identify. It's like, oh, I think this is related to the day of week. But I have had a lot of meetings with low traction relationships. So just like people who have reached out to me that are most likely salespeople or marketing folks want to have just like a very early meeting. I'm more likely to cancel one of those meetings on a Monday or a Friday for the reasons that you mentioned, that just like things come up. Um, but then I've also realized that particularly Europe, for me being on the West Coast right now, is a tricky one because they're a little bit ahead of me. But the timing of my some of my customer service responses just ends up looking like poor reaction to folks in that time zone based on when they were wrapping up and following, saying something to me, and when I usually get around to checking into it. So I'm trying to be more sensitive to that kind of thing, but I haven't thus far found any strategies that make people not cancel meetings. But I'm going to keep that in mind going forward to like kind of keep, even with U.S. business people, I've noticed is like that's a flaky day for whatever reason.
Yeah, agreed. Robert has another question that I thought was really a good one. I appreciate your questions, Robert. It says, "Have you ever had to have a serious conversation remotely, like firing someone?" Has anybody had that experience, or maybe some of those? Maybe if it's not firing somebody, like a difficult conversation.
Yeah, definitely. And this might be sick, but it's way better for me this way than in real life. Well, it's not real life, but in person. In person, it's way harder. But I would say this led us to a weird thing. Like we've hired a few people and things haven't worked out. And one thing we found, and at first it sounds weird, but um, not working with anyone who isn't comfortable with a video camera. We found I've hired a few people from like Upwork and a couple other places that went really well. But sometimes you meet like contractors and stuff, and if they don't have the video on at first, I've just learned it's okay to just ask them to do that. Like, and we've just found a correlation between a little bit of strange things happening when there's some weird reason they don't want to have their video on, especially when if you bring it up and they're really defensive or something like that. And I only say all that because when it comes to those more difficult conversations, the video being on is just you have to have some kind of video because it's so hard to gauge if they even heard you, how they're reacting, if they're taking the counsel well or not. And so um, that's just one thing that we've learned over the years.
That's super valuable, I think, especially when you're talking about collaborating, communicating. Obviously, that's like the number one thing to that you have to be able to do, especially remotely. So that's yeah, that's really key. Have you let's on that same thinking as far as tools and video conferencing obviously is a huge tool to be able to communicate, collaborate with your team. What are some other tools that you have found that you guys have found to be successful in making sure that you're on the same page with someone who's in a completely different country, completely different time zone?
Again, man, I'm learning how ill-equipped I am with tools. I need to look up tools. We don't, there's
Tools
nothing
are
we
just
would,
easy to talk about.
yeah, exactly, yeah. But I'd love to hear if there are any other ideas.
I
Yeah, I
know
think
me
your
and
point
Kevin have used
about
them.
video is a really good one. Sorry, Miles, I didn't mean to talk over you there. That's definitely a good one. I think asynchronous communication styles being like explained is really helpful because it took me a long time to realize, just personally, that people do not expect me to respond immediately when they send me a message in certain channels or certain modes of communication. And trying to learn to follow some of that etiquette myself to silently signal to people whether or not something is urgent or is just kind of like I'm just communicating, but we don't always do that in email because email somehow sounds feels a bit formal or is easy to ignore when it's not. But yeah, so definitely like communicating with the rest of the team um, about how they communicate and what they prefer before I get into a bunch of confusing misunderstandings about whether or not they understood what I said is very, very, very helpful. And so I think that is very similar to what Austin's talking about, where when you're starting a new relationship with a contractor and you can't get them to drop the veil of like, this is who I actually am as a person, it's harder to know anything that would enable you to be empathetic to their situation and not fire them. And so you kind of come to that crossroads sooner if you're having problems because you would love to be empathetic to a real human being, but for some reason, this particular one you're interacting with will not enable you to see them that way, and that's their right, absolutely. But it does make it harder to trust there and feel like you want to continue that relationship for sure.
Yeah, that's really, really important to keep in mind. How about you, Lance? Have you had any experiences in this?
I think just you know, when Austin and I were working together and I was living in Kenya, like we had like I think like a Google sheet or something like that. It was very very lo-fi. We've since upgraded Trello. We do a lot of stuff through that now, and that seems to be working pretty good for us. But I think at that time, because there was that hour gap, and we were on totally different schedules, we would kind of put things out there like, okay, this needs to be done this week, and there was very few times that like something actually needed to be done on a certain day, and so that would be the follow-up email. I guess like Kevin was saying is, there's like certain things that can get done and doesn't need like immediate response, but then just verbalizing like, okay, this needs to be done by this time. Please get back to me. Please write me back to let me know that you got this email and you understand what you need to do. Like I don't think there's any harm in just asking for that.
Yeah, I think having that communication is the key and setting like the precedent to be able to be like, oh, okay, other teams that I've worked on remotely, they have the understanding, okay, if my indicator, like they use Slack, and I say, okay, if my indicator that is that I'm on, or Discord's the same, you can, if your indicator is that you're online, that means you're available to be reached. And if you're not, then you're not, and that's the precedent that they've set. And then other times, yeah, there's been some, there's been teams I've worked with that have been kind of more, yeah, lo-fi, like you mentioned there. It's like, okay, here's the what you need, what needs to be done. Here's a Trello board, or here's a task list, or something in some other project management software like Asana, and you're assigned to it. Just complete it when you're done. If there's an issue, I will tag you or message you through that. So there is a lot of different tools out there. I think the tools that you use isn't as important as the precedent that you set as a manager or as a coworker on when you need to have things or have people available to be able to
Let's
collaborate and work with.
I was gonna say, I was thinking along those same lines. It's not necessarily a tool as in a piece of software, but um, especially because the video thing does kind of have the potential to take away that humanity a bit. I think getting into a good habit and having the precedent set of lots of discussions about commending them, about how well they're doing, about the team in general, even just, you know, laid back fun gatherings. When you already set the precedent of that vibe and like people are used to feeling commended and part of the team, when it comes time to having a more serious conversation, if you have to. Another nice thing about that is usually those serious conversations get weeded out because you're doing that. But if you still have to, it goes so much better when that person's used to you telling them how good a job they're doing. And so I've worked under many people that are the exact opposite, working with some that commendation was not their strong suit. And it is, especially when you're remote, is really, really challenging because it's not like you're in the office and you can hear them being a nice person and you know, oh, they're good. But instead, you just hit close and you sit there with your like sadness by yourself in your little room or whatever. So like if you're not getting that, and then moving to working with Elliot was the exact opposite. Elliot is so good, no matter what you're doing, finding some way to tell you like, oh, that was good. I never knew that. Oh, that's smart. Oh, that's cool. And so when you hit the close button, you're sitting there feeling, you know, somewhat good about yourself, and you are motivated to keep working. So that's a tool, I guess, in general in life, but that has helped.
Yeah, having that feedback and having it not just be the only communication, like you said, the only the communication that you get from someone, be it your manager or a team member, is a negative one, or is you need to do this, is not definitely not conducive to collaborating, especially internationally. Very good. So we'll go ahead and kind of along those, not along this thought, but something that happens to you when you're working internationally. Sometimes software or tools that worked in while you were using a US IP address don't work when you're using a Kenyan IP address or a Thai IP address. Kevin Smith asked the question. He says, "What are your thoughts on the necessity of remote teammates using VPNs? Should it be mandated across an organization, or should it be a team VPN software?" Does anyone have thoughts on that? Kevin?
I don't have much experience speaking about whether or not it should be across the organization or a team thing. My general idea of that is, depending on the size of the organization, one might be a lot more advantageous in terms of what they can enable. Like a big organization probably does need it to be more organization-wide. But specifically on VPNs or no VPNs, it's really smart to familiarize yourself with your own workflows and where you can leak sensitive information out. That goes for any human being that uses digital products, but especially when you're working international, because at some point in time you're accessing a way to pay people. At some point in time, somebody may be accessing a way to pay you through information that you're giving them over the internet. And so you just need to know your kind of footprint and where are there gates that you can lock or not lock. And a VPN is a really nice way to wrap that up in a more locked state, just your general communication, than you would be able to without it. Because different countries are different. You may go to a country where it's very, very common for the cell phone providers and them, ISPs, that kind of thing, to do all sorts of monitoring and throttling and restricting of things. And that could be causing you problems every single day of your work, and you just not recognizing, having come from the US where that's not as common, that's your hiccup. But if you get a VPN and you get that straightened out before you leave, you probably will mitigate a lot of that kind of attrition of like, oh, this is the international world, and now somebody's actually siphoning off my data from the internet cafe because they just sit here all day and know that expatriates like myself come here and use the internet cafe on free Wi-Fi or open Wi-Fi, where everybody's got a shared connection to the same Wi-Fi unit. But if you're on VPN, at least some of that stuff is restricted. So I really do think it's important to use one. The selection's huge. You gotta think about what you're actually doing to know which one to use.
Yeah, that's
I'd
an
like to hear a little bit more from the dog, actually. If
So sorry about that. Frankie hears me talking about VPNs and she comes in here and she's like, let me tell him.
Yeah, that's a I recently again working in India. I found that it's so yeah, Indian. I had assumed that the Indian internet worked very similar to the US because a lot of development, a lot of IT work is done there. That wasn't the case. It is a little bit restricted, not quite restricted in the level of, like, say, China or Russia, but it is a little bit restricted. So sites that, especially when it comes to content, so like sites that I used with education based content, like a Skillshare or something along those lines, they did not work very well because that content was filtered through the Indian IP there that I was, the internet service provider I was using, and then so it was coming in. It was very choppy. It wasn't great. When I use a VPN, worked smoothly. So I know that that's a small thing, but another experience that we had was working, or that my wife had, was working with her organization, accessing things like QuickBooks or super sensitive information, like Kevin was mentioning. They didn't require a VPN, but they should have required a VPN. And maybe there's no like short-term consequences, but there could be definitely some consequences to that. So I think it's important. Another question that came up earlier that kind of is in conjunction with this is Robert asks, have you ever had to work from an internet cafe? So maybe we can talk a little bit about, like, as far as personal tools, or not tools, but like things that you maybe took for granted in your home country or in the US, as the case for all of us, but that you quickly found out was not a standard throughout the world. Who'd like to share maybe something along those lines of having maybe an experience even of like having to work in a less than ideal situation? Lance?
I guess just like the to comment on the like expectations. When I first moved to Nicaragua, I had asked a friend who was already living there, like, "Oh, are there like internet cafes and stuff like that?" And he said, "Oh yeah, yeah, they're all over the place." And so I assumed that it was like an American or a European internet cafe where it's like a Starbucks. Like you go in, bring your laptop, order a coffee, and you can sit there and play Minecraft all day if you want. But what actually the case is it's like a dark room full of computers that have landline or like LAN networks, and there's no Wi-Fi, there's no coffee, you know there's no nothing basically. And so like I had a laptop and I was prepared to go and do all my work on my system, but there wasn't a lot of support for that kind of thing unless you went to an actual cafe, which was much more of a cafe than an internet cafe. They might have free Wi-Fi, but like you're expected to like order like lunch there and like eat and get out basically. So like if you set up your laptop and start working, that people weren't happy about it. So I guess yeah, that's one thing where I expected like one thing from an American viewpoint, and I got there and it was completely different.
Nice. How about you, Austin? Have you had any experiences like that?
Yeah, I think the cultural differences are interesting. Like in Thailand, it's not. It depends. Thailand's very drastic depending on where you go, of course, in the country. But it's very common. You get places, and just the idea of working like that isn't common enough. So there's just nothing built for it. Even if they did have Wi-Fi, like a lot of times they won't have power. So like your computer dies and there's no way to charge it up. Or like Lance said, like just the fact that sitting there looking and feeling weird. Already I'm like a 300-pound human in their country. So I'm already used to like that guy's not normal, and getting the looks and stuff. But then especially when you're there on your computer, it like shouldn't have. Maybe I'm just soft this way, but like it does affect you. Just feel weird and uncomfortable, and especially if you're doing a meeting, a Zoom meeting, like knowing what's around you, you just cannot get in the zone. I would say another thing too is like I was shocked. I think we were traveling just in Spain, and like we kept going to cafe after cafe, and they would have signs that said like had a picture of a laptop with a X over it, and they're basically like, we don't want you in here hogging seats. And then a lot of Europe, you have to pay a charge for restaurants and stuff because you like pay for that table, and they let you stay there as long as you want. But the idea of just going in for free to a place and just working there is like, people are like, that doesn't make sense. So like that, learning those kinds of things definitely helped. And I would say overall, I got kind of jaded with the idea of working at a cafe to where I just really invested in making sure my home setup was comfortable. Um, and even now today, I'm glad I did because obviously we're all, doing that. So, but yeah, there's a lot of weird little things that come up when you're trying to work in public.
Lance?
I just have a quick little anecdote. One time I went into a place that said it was a Wi-Fi cafe, and I asked like, "Oh, could I get like the Wi-Fi password, por favor, or whatever?" And this like little old lady like called over her grandson, and he turned on his hotspot on his phone, and like and that was their Wi-Fi for the whole restaurant. So
That is amazing. I hope he gets to upgrade his phone every now and then.
Yeah, that's I've had both experiences. I think in Korea I was working and they have like actual internet cafes that they have designated. And actually it wasn't as bad, but you have to like some they had to like a line out front and you had a limited amount of time. So if it was like an hour or 2 hours, or others had like where you paid a fee, like $5 or $10 to get in, and you could stay as long as you want. You could have unlimited coffee. It wasn't great coffee, and then maybe like some little snacks. So those were actually pretty nice because it's more geared towards students working in spaces. But recently in India, I was there under lockdown, and so there was no access to anything public. And I thought I had a good setup with internet there. The internet was pretty robust. It was fiber network, but things that I didn't consider were like your power. So when your power is out, you don't have internet. Now, if it's fiber, you can get like a battery and have a backup and still have some internet. So that was like a consideration that I had not previously thought of. Is just having a little bit of power to back you up. Maybe not, maybe it won't last 2 or 3 days, but it'll last a few hours to be able to get you to finish, allow you to finish your work and then move on. So I thought that was my experience, Kevin.
I'm happy to see that some providers of devices have started to make that idea a little bit, like they're more aware of it. So I'm right now one of my backup internet sources when I was in the RV. Well, it's been a primary since COVID started, and I couldn't go to co-working anymore. But I have a small Sprint hotspot, and that has a battery pack in it. It's part of the design, and you can have multiple batteries for it with you. And so on one battery charge, it'll last for about 12 hours, it says, if you're using it. But you could have 3 or 4 of those with you and then be able to keep getting access to the internet through it. But for a long time, there wasn't easy ways to do that stuff. So it's super cool now that there's like even little travel routers that are USB powered. And when you go to a hotel, you can just like plug into that and even, have that hooked up to your VPN service and connect through that stuff. But the power thing is huge in the RV. That got me all the time because if you go to a more remote place and you have good cell service, which thankfully there's a lot of really good cell service in remote places in the U.S., you have this other factor of like how long can you run your RV on battery power, and then that becomes this whole other scale problem of like, oh, if you get solar panels, will they charge fast enough, and are your batteries robust enough to handle the discharge rate you need? There's all these layers to it that get complicated, but yeah, I love just making it in the device where it's like I know I can get that little Wi-Fi spot with a battery.
Nice. Yeah, that's actually a really good tool. I've had the opportunity to use that here recently. It was really nice. Awesome.
This is just another thing, kind of back to the VPN thing, is I know a lot of countries are different, but in Thailand, a lot of times if you're trying to get onto Wi-Fi or stuff, they're very like patriarchal, so like they worship their king, so like they show him so much respect, which as an American is such a weird thing when you go there and realize that that person has respect from like everyone in the country. But anyway, sometimes you'll log into Wi-Fi and the screen will come up, and basically in Thai, it's almost like you're committing to worship him in a sense when you agree to that. It's almost like a weird layer of, you know, commitment that it's like, oh, I never thought that would be the case. But going back to the VPN thing, one little side benefit is that when you're in another country, a lot of times Google and other sites will automatically revert you to Thai language. So like I've spent so much time like trying to go to work and like, oh, I forgot to turn it English, and you have to find the little button that says view this in English, and then sometimes you actually hit the wrong thing, which actually translates the page from Thai to English instead of reversing it. So then it's like bad English, and it's just like if the VPN definitely helps. And even to this day, I think for the rest of my life, there's some sites where like I'll be on my computer that I had in Thailand, and like it'll just be in Thai still, and I'm like, this will never leave me. I'm haunted by this for the rest of my life. So like the VPN definitely I think can save a lot of time when it comes to stuff like that too.
Yeah, I actually, that's one thing you just reminded me. Yeah, everything when I was in India, everything was, even when if I didn't have a VPN on it, everything would come up in rupees or it would be in English, but it would be, not the information I needed to know. I wanted to have a US base. So using a VPN and that was super valuable and yeah, definitely saved some time and some effort. Um, Very nice. And we have Elliot back as a panelist. Good to have you. Thank you so much.
Hey there. Sorry, I didn't realize rejoining would automatically throw me back into the panel.
No worries. It's good to see you.
We're doing it live.
So I think we have a little bit of time left. So I just wanted to maybe get your thoughts, Lance and Austin and Elliot, now to you, and Kevin, whatever you have. But really on maybe some guidelines that you think are important. We've kind of touched on some different ones, but what are some guidelines that you think are important in collaborating and working with people that are in a completely different time zone, completely different country than you are? Kevin?
One thing I think is really important is an idea I learned from Wilson Learning. It's a company that does human performance improvement training in the U.S. and they do it internationally, but I worked for them in the U.S. And they teach something called social styles, which is similar to sort of like a personality test, but it's more about being able to empathize with somebody else's preferred way to communicate. And so developing the skill of recognizing that somebody else prefers a different method of communication than you do. And what I'm talking about is somebody who likes to get right to the point versus talk about their day a little bit first. Those are two very different styles. One is wants to relate first, the other one wants to drive more and just kind of get right to the point. But there's this idea of relationship and task tension. And that idea, kind of simply put, is if you don't get the relationship trust or tension down low enough with the two people, they won't be able to work well because they'll be distracted with their relationship with each other, of how he finishes that sentence, or the tone of voice was used when that was said, the way the period comes after the okay in the text message. Those things are things to wonder about. But once you get used to someone, that goes down and it's a lot easier to go to work. But if you focus too much on work, the relationship will start to wane and each person will start to get a little bit sensitive. And so I think that is one of the most valuable concepts I've ever learned when it comes to working with people as part of teams, is learning to recognize that when you're having difficulty communicating, nobody has malice automatically by default that you've figured out. You just have noticed that the communication is not the same style. And if you can be versatile because of that empathy, then a lot of stuff will just smooth out. And so particularly like when it comes to chat, I've realized like when you're sharing ideas, if you can talk about people, if you can acknowledge people's ideas before going into implementation, it really dignifies them a lot. And I struggle with that terribly because my mind just like snaps to implementation whenever I hear my own ideas. But anyway, so those two things for me I think are good guidelines. Of one, recognizing that communication problems are just a style thing most of the time. And if you can think about that, you can be more empathetic, and then in terms of being willing to adjust. And then when you're communicating to somebody who's expressing ideas to you, trying to brainstorm, just like work in the positive of saying everything's good until you get that relationship tension down enough where people feel comfortable enough being like, okay, what will actually work?
That's super valuable. Yeah, that's really good thoughts. Austin,
Yeah,
what do you? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Lance.
sorry. Yeah, I think like whenever or since I've been like more and more like working remotely, and especially now with this like with the pandemic and everything, I feel like I'm constantly trying to uh like like through Zoom meetings and working online and emails and everything, it seems like that's like I have to become the computer a little bit to function that way. Like I have to like use like my like logic brain. And so when I'm like interacting with a person, I try my best to like pull back to the other side of the spectrum and like use like my heart and my human brain, so that like to find a balance there, because sometimes you do just have to say, hey, we need this done by Tuesday, get it done, you know. But if you say that, like Kevin mentioned, like just like the period at the end of a statement can go from saying like, hey, we need this done Tuesday, to hey, we need this done Tuesday. You know, it can make a big difference. So like adding in that little like, hey, we're still friends though, like, you know, like I'm not angry with you, or in some form of some way. And I feel like that's like removing yourself from the computer or from the digital space, and like really trying to be like a human in all your communication.
Very good. Austin?
Yeah, I was going to tag on to that and just say Lance and I are just always extremely offensive to each other at all times. So that's our baseline, so that we never have to worry about that happening. But I would say for me, learning this from both ends as an employee, as in a managerial position, um, I had to shift from thinking traditional offices in a building, 9 to 5, whatever, is the normal right way. And what we're doing is weird. And what tools do we use? What do we use to try to match that style of working? But I've learned that, and especially these days, as the world is changing, I don't think we should look at it that way. I think we should look at it honestly as superior and as, a better way. So for me, how that affects like daily activity is like, instead of like talking about how can we like, what tool can we use to match this because in the office we would do this, instead just focus and kind of work on the things that are better because of this. So like, instead of trying to really fix the time gap, because if we were in the same office, we'd be on the same time zone, so we could talk. Why not just emphasize how amazing it is that, I can work at midnight if I want, I can work at 4 a.m. if I want, and like give that leeway to the people you work with. And like Lance mentioned earlier, like when we work together, I think a big part of that, and this isn't possible 100% of the time, but keep deadlines somewhat loose and just try to get into the habit of having a workflow that gives you time. And like as the person selling the job or directing the job, that oftentimes falls on you. But try to do that, because it's a beautiful thing is like when I was working with Kindly Ops, like as I'm going to bed, you guys are getting up and working. And like right now we have developers in Gold Coast in Australia. And so like it's beautiful because like I'll be working all day working on wireframes and working on looking at bugs, and then they're just waking up when I'm ending my day and they take the baton. So like I just think stop trying to figure out like how can we fit this weird thing into the mold. I think that mold is wrong, and like remote work is just going to be the future. And so let's just focus on how we can make that the best way it can be.
That's awesome. Elliot?
Yeah, you mentioned time zones also. So time zones are a thing that like we can say, sure, we're fine with working at different time zones. We understand we're going to pass the baton. We know it's night there and it's bright here. But they're a thing that is wired so hard into our biochemistry. Like, not only do you feel differently when you've been working for 8 hours or 12 hours and you're trying to wrap up to get to your next obligation than you do when you're just like slowly sipping that first cup of coffee and getting oriented. But like the chemistry levels in your body are actually changing and like giving you signals like it's time to go to sleep. You're hungry or you're not hungry. All those things fight against you every single day. And no matter how much you're like self-aware, the people who are at work, every single person in their life is on their time zone, right? And they haven't opted in to all of this weirdness that we're opting into. And so the thing that I found is like time zones are like your enemy forever, every 24 hours a day, every single day. They will eventually wear you down. So one technique I've used is to try and find ways to reduce communication, to reduce synchronization between teams that are actually in totally different time zones. And so I like to have a small break teams into squads, sort of, that have at least a half day overlap. If there's a half day overlap, you can really, really get in a groove. And then when you have a person or a team who really doesn't have that half day overlap, do your synchronization, do your communication asynchronously, but try as much as you can to not have to have synchronous communication. And so one of the tools we use for that is to put information radiators everywhere we can. What kind of notifications can we have coming out of the content management system, out of the version control system for code, so that just all these little status updates are bubbling out automatically, and you sort of don't need as much synchronous checking in with people. Of course, you still want to stay in touch, but just being sympathetic to try and reduce the amount of daily communication that's needed has helped me a lot.
That's really valuable. Lance, what are your thoughts?
I think, yeah, I mean, I think that verbalized a lot of my own thoughts about time zones. Like when I was in Kenya and working with Austin, and even when I was teaching in China, like, uh, like the less communication that I had to, like, or the less I had to talk with someone, it really was the better, and I ended up getting all the same information because we were doing that. We were putting information everywhere. We were sending emails that didn't demand a response, just like updates through emails that I could get in the morning and know what I had to do and not have to respond like, oh, hey buddy, whatever. Um, and yeah, I think that's a great point. I never had the words to really put it that way, but yeah, that's great.
Awesome.
I was just going to add, like, based on Elliot's comments, I think the highest level, implementation you could do, knowing that that's going to be the most effective way to work, is during the hiring process, learning whether or not someone can, because a lot of people cannot work that way. They need the daily, you know, touchstone. They need to talk to someone in management regularly, and maybe you can deduce during interviewing process whether or not that's going to be a trainable quality or whether that's not, because it is true that especially the time zone thing, that can become a really big problem. So that's I think a really early implementation of how to apply that.
Yeah, that's really key. And I think too, like all of we've all touched on is shifting the thinking from being time based to being output based. And that can be over any time zone or with being any kind of systems or whatever that we use together. But changing that I think is key, and also kind of like partners with working remotely, and having at least having success in working remotely. That's awesome. Thank you all for your thoughts. So we just have a real brief time here, about 2 minutes. I'd like to just kind of conclude our discussion here today by thinking about the future of work. What maybe changes do you personally want to see, or where you think things are heading that you agree with or that you don't agree with? Maybe we can get our panelists' thoughts here, Austin and Lance. Lance, well, maybe we get yours first, and then Austin, and then we can conclude.
I think the only thing that really comes to mind is kind of how Austin and I work together. Like I'm technically an employee of his firm, and I have no stake in or power or anything. But he lets me take care of all of my work as if I'm the lord of my own domain. There's not a lot of oversight or micromanaging because there doesn't has to be, or doesn't have to be. Like he trusts that I can get this work done, and because he's given me that trust, I now like feel the responsibility to get it all done. I feel like that's such a great way to work, and I would like to see that more and more companies where instead of you have like a manager, supervisor, shift manager, script manager, whatever, have one person that kind of takes care of all their stuff. And of course, that goes back to the hiring process. You have to make sure that you get someone who's self-motivated and everything. But that's what I would like to see in the future.
I think, yeah, firmly agreed. I think so. What I would like to see that is maybe that introduced into the education system more, instead of focusing on maybe trigonometry and algebra. Let's teach kids how to be self motivated, teach kids how to work on their own. I think that's going to happen naturally because a lot of kids are doing school like this now. So like they don't have the teach. Same thing like with us at work. They are now learning at a young age that they have to do the test because they have to do it and they aren't going to have someone watching over them. So I would like to see more and more stuff like that being taught at kids at a young age, because then they're, as they grow up, they'll be used to this, and you'll be able to find and hire more people that are just completely comfortable with, taking direction and running with it.
That is a beautiful thought. And I think that's honestly a beautiful way to end our discussion here today. So we'll thank you so much, Austin and Lance, for your contributions, for being on the panel, and we look forward to having you on again. And thank you everyone for watching our first Kindly People Ops talk show. Look forward to future times together. So until next time, bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks a lot, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, guys. Have a good one.